James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, a great honor to rise and speak on behalf of the people of Timmins, James Bay. And speaking on this issue of Bill C-46, which is the so-called Pipeline Safety Act, the amendment to the National Energy Board Act. As I rise today back home, there's great concern in my region about the derailment, the third derailment in this past month in our region, 2 tanker derailments in the little community of Gogama, 1 at Hornpain. The fact that we have 29 cars carrying heavy crude going off the tracks, a number of them burning still out of control in the Matagami River right now. The Matagami River, which runs from that part of northern Ontario right through the heart of the city of Timmins, through communities like Smooth Rock Falls, up into the Missinabie and the Moose Rivers in James Bay, a huge drainage area of 37,000 kilometers that's affected. The fact that this heavy crude is burning in a fish habitat down very close to the community of Matagami First Nation, very close to Gogama. And we need to look at these issues in terms of government policy, because we saw the horrific tragedy at Lac-Mégantic this past summer, and we saw the failed safety measures. We saw the promises that have been put in place of allowing companies to look after themselves, that somehow Canadians would be better protected in this privatized world, that if you let corporations look after themselves without oversight, everything will be fine. And many, many, many good people in Lac-Mégantic died because of that. And if this train had derailed just a few kilometers off of where it did into the and not into the river, but in the community of Gogama, we could have had a repeat of Lac-Mégantic. And for all of us across so much of Canada and across the north, where our communities are built on the rail lines, across the street from my house, the Ontario Northland carries its heavy-duty sulfur cars, sulfuric acid from the smelter in Rouyn-Noranda. In fact, my home, my street address is mileage 104 on the railway line. We are so closely tied to the issues of safety. And Mr. Speaker, I speak of that in terms of the huge economic impact the oil industry has in our country. It's a huge driver. But also we need to start addressing the growing environmental impact to make sure that there is a balance. And you know, there will be some people who say, Mr. Speaker, well, we won't ship them by rail anymore. Let's get the pipelines through. And once the pipelines are through, we won't have to worry anymore. But the problem, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of a long-term vision of this government, where they, as my colleague from Toronto, Danforth, said, they only believe in the rip and ship philosophy. There's something fundamentally economically wrong when your vision of a national economy is to take raw bitumen out of the ground, ship it 2,000 kilometers to a port in Quebec so it can be shipped off to China or someplace else to be processed. That is an abomination. That is not an economic plan. And the people who carry the risk are the people living along that pipeline, because this government stripped all the environmental protection acts in this country, stripped the Navigable Waters Act, so that the need to have the shutoff valves on the rivers, they don't exist anymore. And we're told that somehow this is in all our interests. I see the oil industry ads all over Ottawa say it's your oil, it's our oil. Let's do the right thing. It ain't our oil. It should be. It should be Canada's interest. No, it's our risk. The benefits are going to the Koch brothers in the U.S. They're going offshore. Ask any northerner at the pump. So for all the damage you've suffered in the economy lately, when have you ever had a break on your gas prices? You ain't ever got one. No. So we need to look at this. I look at this bill, and there's some good things in this bill about issues of liability. But, Mr. Speaker, I looked at it's dealing with the National Energy Board. And when I ask people back home whether or not the processes that are in place to protect the public, if I look at the National Energy Board, I don't feel much comfort. I guess if I was an oil lobbyist, I'd feel great. If I was one of the big Suncor or Sunoco, I'd think the National Energy Board, boy, those are good guys. But you look at Energy East. This is a major, major, major project that's happening. And so the public have a right to participate. Because if we're talking about moving bitumen through pipeline, there needs to be public buy-in. They have to understand what is at stake. And the National Energy Board needs to hear from the citizens about what's at stake. But you don't get to write a letter to the National Energy Board. You have to write a letter in order to be able to write a letter. The National Energy Board doesn't accept unsolicited letters. No. You have to apply, and then they'll decide whether or not your opinion counts. Well, I'm sorry, that is not how you build public trust. That is not social license. The National Energy Board will decide, they get to decide whether or not your letters will be posted or whether they'll outright refuse them. And so whether granting or refusing a project application, it impinges on whether or not there's a direct effect on the person's interest, the degree of connection between the project and the person, the likelihood of severity of harm that a person is exposed to, the frequency and duration of a person's use of an area near the project. So I'm trying to interpret what that means. Maybe if I live right on top of the pipeline, I get to go to the hearings and say whether or not I like it. But if I am like the citizens of Timmins in the case of the Gogama derailment, if I am part of the larger population of 37,000 square kilometers that has been impacted by this present derailment, do any of those people, if that was a pipeline blowout, would any of those people be allowed to speak at the National Energy Board hearings? Because, Mr. Speaker, the issue we're dealing with here, again, with crude, with oil, with a national vision that says there's no point processing and upgrading in our own country where we can create value-added jobs and ensure that the great gifts that we have in terms of resources, of oil and gas, of mineral production, that there's no national vision to upgrade, to make sure there's value added, so we're taking less out of the ground because we're going to actually see more in our economy, that there's no vision of that. But we're being told that somehow we should trust the pipeline agenda because this government has turned our country into a petrostate. And like all petrostates are corrupt. We see their attack on bird watchers, on environmental organizations, on anyone who speaks up against their agenda. And we're supposed to believe that bitumen, well, it's just like oil, but it's not, Mr. Speaker. So I'm looking at Bill C-46, and they talk about $1 billion liability. Well, $1 billion liability was passed in terms of the damage that Enbridge did to the Kalamazoo River. And they're still being ordered by the Environmental Protection Agency to go back and fix the damage that they did to the Kalamazoo River. They may not ever be able to fix the damage that they did to the Kalamazoo River. And that was because they didn't have the proper oversight. So I'm thinking of a pipeline running through Northern Ontario like the way the train ran through Gogama. If there's a blowout and it's carrying bitumen, is there enough protection in this bill to offset the billions of dollars in damage that will accrue? If this Northern Gateway pipeline had ever gone through, where you were blowing bitumen out through the BC mountains, how would you get to that? You know, when you drive up through mountains in BC and you see sometimes there's trucks at the bottom because it was too difficult to get down to get the trucks that went off the edge, that we'd be able to somehow get the bitumen off those rivers. That's why President Obama rejected Keystone. He rejected Keystone contrary to the demands of the Liberal Party leader and the Conservative Party leader because he said it wasn't in America's interest to take the risk without the benefit. So I'm looking, Mr. Speaker, in terms of where we need to be with an economy. Our natural resources are vital to us, but it has to be done. There has to be social license. It has to be done in terms of safety, and it has to be done with the long-term implications that if you're going to be moving products like bitumen out of the ground, that you're doing it in a safe way. They failed with our rail, and we've had too many accidents, and we need accountability there. But if we're supposed to trust that this bill will protect us on pipelines when we see the collusion of the oil interests in the Conservative government, I don't believe them, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe them for a moment, and I don't think Canadians believe them either. So we are interested in this bill. We want to bring it to committee, but there's a bigger issue about environmental accountability that has to be addressed by this nation.
Questions and